At the Kremlin, October 1944. Stalin knew how to bottle spirit. He knew how to crush it too. Churchill had been running on his spirit of choice since 1940, when he first unleashed his intoxicating rhetoric against the foe. Uncle Joe had deep reserves of charm and charisma to call on, though he uncorked his hidden affability more rarely than he did the vintage wines looted years before from the Tsar's liberated cellars. The weary Churchill had begun recently to see that the war was slipping away from him. To the east, the Red Army continued its unforgiving sweep, while in France, American outnumbered English soldiers 3-1. Eisenhower's plan had worked in spite of the misgivings of the British generals. The old man was convinced that he could strike a deal with Joe to shape a peace that might keep the Soviet giant at bay, far from the European heartland, far away from Germany. To reach Moscow, he'd flown in sleepless hops in secret through the dangerous night skies by way of Cairo and Naples. He arrived strung out on exhaustion and fortified by more tumblers of brandy than his entourage wished to count. In the darkness of winter Moscow, the high-flying statesman had decided that he could charm the implacable dictator, disarm him with an aristocratic display of bonhomie. The small hours. With these two leaders alone, they were surrounded by the world's most discreet translators, note-takers, and schedule keepers, as close to solitude as such men could be. They tuned out these lesser men whose presence was an unavoidable necessity. The Kremlin made a forbidding casino. Fate and destiny ran the house. Between them, they cover the action no matter how high the stakes. Winnie and Joe, two of the highest high rollers. The game over before it got started, but played to the bitter end. Churchill scribbled his infamous note, attempting to force his opponent into revealing his hand. The old man had to acknowledge that no one could prevent Stalin's triumph. The Soviet Empire must expand. Churchill, the old soldier, appearing to surrender, made his last stand. Bulgaria, Romania both lost. He offered to trade them for Greece. Stalin conceded. He ticked the items on Churchill's note. The scribbled record the old man wanted destroyed, but Joe was anxious to preserve the scrap of proof. He wanted Churchill to know that Stalin could always expose him, show the world the old man's busted flush. With so much of Europe in his pocket, he could afford to let Greece go.
But I shall be sober in the morning. July 1945. He sits alone, a giant diminished, a Gulliver bound down by Lilliputians. Suddenly his age shows, as though his body has shriveled within his suit. With his cigars and flamboyance, he was the man of the hour before the hour struck. The expression on his face conveys the bitter savour of this unlooked-for rejection. Crosses more numerous than those in battlefield graveyards build up the volume of his defeat. The honourable member of Woodford is out of office, Prime Minister no more. So much for the spoils of this Victorian war. As for the empire he lived for, his successor is already dismembering it, at least in his head. The heroic age that fueled the Churchillian fantasy is finally dead. The old man was dignified in his humiliation. He was recalled from the victors' meeting to surrender his seals of office to an impotent king. At Potsdam, Truman and Stalin remained deep in their conversation, carving up the world. Churchill was helpless. The leader of His Majesty's opposition has only brandy dreams and the smoke from those celebrated cigars to cushion him, now that the public's landslide has swept all his power away. Bessie Braddock? Who's she? Why, she's the socialist Amazon from Liverpool, fresh to Westminster, but not about to let herself be overawed or intimidated. She's been all but running a city for 15 years. She's glad that the old order was swept aside. She's been dug in deep for years on the other side of the class war trenches. Great men are not going to upstage her. But she's never been this close to him before. There he is, the enemy, on the other side of the room. The enemy, but the man who taught language its habits of command. The man who turned rhetoric into a tool for survival. She's shocked. At a glance she can see that the fire's gone out. She's shocked almost into mercy. But Bessie's always specialised in tough love. It's doubtful if she knows any other kind. Here is a great man sunk into pitying himself and keeping the cold winds at bay with the warmth of brandy. She approaches him. Does he know who she is? Does he care? What will she say? Mr. Churchill, you're drunk. She says it quietly, calmly, her voice for coaxing a wayward child. The old man is stung into attention. Now that she speaks, he knows her, as she knew him. The enemy. Quiet, her voice, but not conciliatory. He rallies. In fuddled anger he strikes, wielding his contemptuous dignity. You, madam, he says, are ugly. Bessie is built for distance, but the close are bitter fight. No room in her for elegance, grace or speed. The old man presses home his advantage. But I, he adds, will be sober in the morning. Bessie is merciful. She turns and strides away.
Mr. Alec, modest in victory, tenacious in defeat. David Lowe, or someone with wit as sharp as he, might have compared us, Winston and I, to Laurel and Hardy. A timid and skinny Englishman partnered with an overbearing, bulky Yank. But people never find it easy to remember that Winston's half American. He's worked for much of his long life on perfecting the voice of British aristocracy. I imagine Roosevelt often pondered how deeply buried his American mother must be. Still, the grain of truth is big enough to make the joke convincing. Perhaps Stan Laurel was in Winston's mind when he described me as a modest little man. Adding, so the story goes, a little man with much to be modest about. I can easily imagine how his breakfast brandy could set the phrase loose upon his tongue. His words, though he has denied he ever said them, must have returned hauntingly when he realised that he'd lost an election to me. Overnight, unexpectedly, the understudy had become the star. He was right as far as that goes. In my career, I've always practiced the virtue of modesty. It's always served me well. Only a truly modest man can be strong enough to support the crushing weight of power, when the lives of millions might be saved or lost by an inspired or a clumsy choice. Winston performed the leader's part flamboyantly. He'd spent his lifetime preparing for this moment. He saw the role of Atlas as his destiny. But I could never be so forgetful of the chasm between the office and the man. In the Great War, when I took part in the futile battles fought and lost on the beaches at Gallipoli, that's where I learned about modesty. I was young and inexperienced when I was forced from day to day to juggle the demands of thoughtless orders against the need to keep my men alive. At the end, when the generals finally ordered a retreat, I stayed late on those lethal beaches. My job as an officer in the rear guard was to hold the enemy off, to allow the living, as many as could, a chance to escape alive. I did the little that could be done. Then I ordered details to dig pits and fill them with the rotting guts and brains of young men who would never leave those beaches again. That disaster grew from a victory that Winston, as the first Sea Lord, had imagined. A landing on well-defended beaches with the Army and the Navy working hand in glove. That was the plan. The generals and the admirals failed him. None of them knew how difficult it would be to realise Winston's brilliant dream. Orders were given. Planners cobbled together schemes that had to be fueled by reckless courage, lubricated with too much blood spilt too carelessly. Winston and I understood each other. He managed the war, while I planned for the peace, when all the debts would have to be settled, when the blood, sweat and tears would have to be repaid with interest, when sacrifice could no longer be our watchword. The people demanded a harvesting of the fruits of victory.
Westminster College, Fulton, Missouri, 1946. There is nothing more of me than you see before you. I have no might of government at my beck and call. Yet there can be few private citizens who might expect the President himself to travel so far from his capital, in spite of demands of his office, to conduct me personally to this college and to introduce me to you. So Churchill's speech began, as I recall, even though he was there, poised behind a bank of microphones that would relay his words across our vast nation. I was hardly able to believe that my letter to Mr. Truman could have so remarkable an outcome. All of us mesmerized by that gruff and celebrated voice. The locomotive thunders through the long hours of night, hauling a human freight, its mournful horn lamenting every swallowed mile between Washington, D.C. and Westminster, Missouri. In this stateroom, a conclave of the great, the President of the United States, an admiral, and a legend among the world's statesmen. In privacy, the heavy themes they must every day deliberate are set aside. Their discourse leaves the problems of the future unbroached. Their intelligence is focused on their poker game. The pack is shuffled and cut, cards dealt. Some cards lay helplessly exposed on the table. Others become parts of each closely guarded hand. The old man finds this night, this concentration of power consoling. Tomorrow he will speak in public, to share a dream his hosts will be unable to comprehend. Now he's anxious that the cards bend to his will. The deck is shuffled and the bets are laid. The cards are reckoned and the hand is played. The microphones that had made his old man's voice audible across the nations are switched off. His listeners in the hall have all absorbed his phrases. He has set before them all his vision, the destiny of what he calls the English-speaking people. Now they can see that he'll always be the minister of King George. He seems to expect the fledgling empire of the United States will share its hegemony with the empire he represents, even as he recognizes that the sun has already set.
Lady Churchill does not regret. I heard the artist called me a vandal. I will not express regret. I destroyed his precious work, and I would do so again. That monster had no part of empathy in him. The true subject of his portrait was his own reputation. His picture was the crime, not my vandalism. I defended what I loved. 80 years are bound to leave their traces. His great days at the dispatch box had passed. Sutherland should have turned away if he could see no sign before him of the man Parliament was paying him to honour. Devoid of decency, he perpetrated his crime. Unblinking, he anatomized the symptoms of Winston's decline. That they commissioned a portrait was bad enough. They assembled a joint committee of the Houses of the Commons and the Lords. I can see them, all self-importance and love of their own voices. Whoever this great commission goes to, we will be judged. We must do all in our power to ensure our choice is right. He must be the finest British artist we can find. He mustn't let the old dog intimidate him. We'll have a document to all posterity. That was their 80th birthday present to him. After 2 years, my rage broke free. It depressed Winston. It wasn't the man he wanted the world to see. So I began to slash at the canvas, cutting gash after gash. Couldn't they have found some hack willing to work from a photograph?
The artist asserts his right of reply. I could see instantly, at our very first meeting, she had already chosen the path of vendetta. Simply, she loathed me, on sight. In her eyes, I was hardly more than a body snatcher. Worse, she believed the commission could only make a thief of me. She thought I would take his life away, embalm him while he struggled to stay alive. She was so fragile, yet she burned with ferocity. She fussed about him, trying to delay the moment of her leaving when he must be unprotected from the dark arts she was certain I'd practice upon him. There was even a hint of rivalry. He had become her malleable, cantankerous pet, who could understand everything she said. She was reluctant to surrender him. And that committee, I knew what they wanted. They were after a boardroom portrait. They were expecting me to lie. He was, after all, still the Prime Minister. The title remained his, even though the Cabinet had to govern without him. They wanted a portrait, and they commissioned me. Did they expect me to do their bidding? Portrait or landscape? Can any distinction be plainer? Yet it seemed unclear to me as I scanned his face, his head, his hands, as I planned the picture's shape, as I began sketching. He soon decided that he need pay no heed to me. His face was unguarded as he abandoned his present of painful limitation, as he exercised an old man's license to roam through the mindscapes of his memory, among a jumble of long completed presents. I felt that he'd become some part of nature, old, craggy, enduring, though time might strip away his every distinctive feature, as though he were the weathered core of something once majestic. I worked to portray his courage and his massiveness, even in so steep a decline.
My God, dear chap, how could you have failed to notice? Really, you must do something. You have to put it right. He looks like bloody Benito Mussolini. To a T. Please, dear chap, you have to actually think again. We can't have something like that standing in Parliament Square. And another thing, you've made him look too young for his finest hour. He looks more like he did in the First War, 20 years before he became Prime Minister. By the 40s, he was an old man. Perhaps we need the feeling that he was living on borrowed time, with only duty and will to sustain him. Is that our answer? Age him, lower his brow, give him a Churchillian scowl. Mussolini never lived long enough to age graciously or otherwise. And a walking stick, too. They want her ladyship to unveil it. For God's sake, try not to upset her. Remember what happened to Sutherland.
The monument in Parliament Square. Here we must conclude our walk for today. Before we separate, before we go our several ways, let's consider this mighty bronze. As we can see, it's Winston Churchill. He wears great coat and helmet. His pose is martial. He is heroically determined to win the war. He towers above us, the incarnation of his eventual victory. The bronze is 12 feet high, more than twice the size of the man. The plinth alone is high enough to overawe us. He faces south across the square, his face, his gaze fixed on the Parliament buildings. We can almost hear the gruff and choppy cadences of those rhetorical flights that took the bitter facts of defeat and transformed them, extracting from them the beginnings of an ultimate victory. We recognise how the sculptor has given stature to that voice, while the man, the fleeting creature of vulnerable and sentient flesh, is crushed beneath the mass of bronze. The man is translated, his only body this emblem of his enduring myth. We can picture now how he might have stood on this very spot on a morning bleak with smoke and dust as he surveyed the rubble that remained where the House of Commons chamber had been standing just the evening before. Here he is. Destruction has hardened his resolve. He knows the price that will be paid at last for victory. Now, I must thank you for your company today, and hope to see more of you before you return home. Some of you may care to join me on our inns and taverns walk this evening. I look forward to meeting some of you again.